The first thing that I realized when I opened Final Fantasy I was that I should have had my speakers turned down, as I had the iconic prelude song blasted into my ears. You're greeted with a monologue that introduces the story of the game, which reads as follows. The world is veiled in darkness. The wind stops, the sea is wild, and the earth begins to rot. The people wait their only hope, a prophecy. When the world is in darkness, 4 warriors will come. After a long journey, 4 young warriors arrive, each holding an orb. Sounds dire if you ask me. You then press A and are led to the start screen, where you can continue, start a new game, and alter the respawn rate. I found out later that the respawn rate changes how fast the text boxes in battle scroll and appear or disappear. 8 is the fastest speed. I wouldn't recommend it in a casual playthrough as it's hard to keep up, and 1 is slow. I stuck with a respawn rate of 7 the entire game. The third screen after selecting New Game brings you to your 4 warriors. I feel like there was a great effort to make the game cleanly balanced between all 6 of the possible starter classes. However, after finishing the game, I see some clear winners. First off is the Fighter, which is a melee class with great strength, great defense, but a definite vulnerability to special attacks and magic. Then there is the Thief next, which I did not use. The last melee class is the Black Belt, or Monk as it would be known later on in other games, which serves as both a great spare inventory and a massive damage anchor which gets exponentially more powerful as the game continues. After the melee classes come the 3 mage classes. The first one is the Red Mage, a balanced character with an average grade in all stats and the ability to learn both white magic and black magic. For future reference, white magic is mostly support magic with some purity-themed attacks. Black magic has a lot of debilitating status effect magic with powerful destruction attacks. Consequently, there is also the White Mage and the Black Mage as the final 2 classes, of which I only had a Black Mage. My team for the entire game is as follows: a Fighter, a Black Belt, a Red Mage, and a Black Mage. My recommendation, though, is that under no circumstance should your team not have a White Mage. Just because the Red Mage has access to both types of magic does not mean that the Red Mage can use the most powerful magic of each kind. The great thing about this character selection, though, is that the names of the characters are entirely up to you. This story has a plot, sure, and later games will offer suggestions as to canon names that fit with the plot, but it is still up to you whether you want to name your characters Dingus 1, 2, 3, and 4, or something else. Final Fantasy I, however, simply has 4 warriors in the plot that bring peace. It doesn't matter who they are or what class they are. What the characters are in the game are entirely up to you. I spent about half an hour debating if I should use joke names or real names for the characters, but eventually I caved into impatience and named all 4 of my characters after the cast of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And just like that, you are immediately plopped into the Final Fantasy I map with an allowance of 400 gil and a mission to restore the orbs. That screen transition where the black borders fade in from the top and bottom of the screen will occur every time you enter or exit anywhere in the entire game. Like it or not, it's here to stay. Personally, I don't mind it, and it's actually pretty exciting to see the borders open on a new area. I had to get used to the buttons fast. I figured out how to open my character menu, and was greeted with a rainbow flash for the transition. That's the other transition, of course. You'll see that rainbow flash every single time you open your character menu, open the character order menu, encounter a monster, or close any of those 3 menus. I like this one a little less because it lengthens the time you have to sit still before you're allowed to move again within a single area, and it can be a bit of an eyesore in the lighter areas. Any part of the map will flash rainbow, and sprites plus black backgrounds will not. I guess the NES needed time to load somehow. The menu for the entire game is nice. It's simple, and you can get wherever you want to go in an instant. Out of the entire game, I had one single problem with the menu, and it was that you can't rearrange anything. I would have liked to have my healing potions in the first slot, since I used, well, a lot. Probably the funniest thing, though, is that at the beginning of the game, if you don't have anything, the game will just say, "You have nothing." Way to cut to the chase, man. Also the music. This track in particular for the overworld is joyful and somewhat catchy, but I will admit it got old once I reached the end of the game. It just didn't fit the atmosphere that the story was spelling out, which may also just be an NES memory problem about reusing music. But it really isn't bad either. Well, I guess I should find out what I'm doing here. Let's head into town. You'll find out quickly that there are two things that are sort of annoying. Sometimes you'll try to talk to someone, face the wrong direction, and have to wait about 1.5 seconds for the "nothing here" text box to go away. And NPCs are not only collidable, but move randomly. These are situation specific, but sometimes it can be a pain in the neck if you're trying to get into a store and there's an NPC wandering around the only one block path into it. This will become much more prevalent later. The first evidence of the NES's limits would be that your character's names and the magic spells' names must be 4 letters, which results in some hilarity early into the game. It's also impressive that the English translation managed to fit it into the same space that the Japanese translation did. The second, which appears here in this first town, would be the NPC's singular text boxes. Some NPCs in towns will say one thing, ever, the entire game. To get around this, there are some characters that disappear after the player talks to them, or sometimes a character will have a different text box after completing an event in the world. It's a clever solution for the limit present here. Another note about the town music. Funnily enough, this isn't the music that plays in every town, but considering how essential towns are to your victory, you'll also be hearing this theme a lot. There are commodities present in Coneria which are present in most towns in the game, but not all. In a good town, you'll have the 2 party health buildings, including the inn to heal your party members, and the clinic to revive your members. There will also be the supply stores which sell weapons, armor, and items, and the magic stores that sell white magic and black magic spells. Every single town in the game, save for 2 places, has an inn, which will be your go-to save station. Each of the towns have something that the others do not as well, though only some of the towns are missing stores. The cost of the town's commodities also increase the deeper you get into the game. The inn at the starter town costs only 40 gil, but at the furthest town with an inn, you'll be paying 500 gil instead. That's over 12 times as much money. The cost of magic also increases, but the quality of the spells available also increase. You can measure your progression in the game based on what spells are available in each town that you visit. The only common store that does not increase in value is the item shop, and honestly, if it did, then I would have spent far longer on this game than I did in this playthrough. I made the mistake of buying armor and weapons carelessly when I started out. See, not all classes use the same armor sets or the same weapons. The black belt will actually require no weapon after the first couple dungeons. The trouble here though is that there is absolutely no way to know who wears what or fights with what unless you buy one of each item and try them individually. That, or use the internet. Everyone can hold any kind of equipment, but not everyone is allowed to use any kind of equipment in battle. The system is a little bit different from magic. If your wizard can't learn a spell due to their class, then you're simply told so. You'll be seeing a lot of that message if you decide to pick a red mage. The entire magic system is vastly different from the magic systems of modern RPGs, and it is far, far more risky. I recommend that, nowadays, before you think about getting a spell from the magic stores, look it up to see what it does. You should also be careful of how many spells you decide to learn. This is one of my biggest issues with the original Final Fantasy I, magic conservation. For each spell level, you are allowed 3 empty slots for spells of that level. Most spells of each level will be located in a singular store so that you can gain a full scope of what you must purchase. The issue here, though, is that you absolutely cannot get rid of a spell that you've learned in the NES version. If you accidentally buy a spell, or accidentally buy a useless spell without knowing any better, that's it. you're stuck with that spell for the rest of the game. Now, what do I mean by useless spells? Well, I found this out after making the mistake myself with the level 2 spell Temper. A very small quantity of the spells sold in stores are not coded correctly and either function against you or do not work at all. The full list includes Lock, Lock 2, Temper, Saber, Exfer, and Heal 2. The bugs with these 6 spells are as follows: doesn't work at all, actually increases your enemy's evasion stat by 20 instead of decreasing by 20, doesn't work at all, doesn't work at all, removes elemental defenses from your party, and is boosted to the next grade of spell when used in battle. There are other spells that function as intended but do not perform as well so late into the game. For my spell recommendations, there are only a few that you can't skip. I found that most of my critical spells were saved until I fought bosses, and using those spells I absolutely steamrollered each boss. I recommend the following. Save your money if you can't afford any other spells. There are some other situational spells that will be useful at some point, such as Invis 2, but much later in the game you get access to magic items which can do it for you. Much later though. If you have a free slot, why not? 2 things to note though. First, notice that a lot of these spells require white mages. That's why it's critical to have a white mage on your team. Second, how on earth would you know that some of these spells are plain broken without looking it up? I don't want to make it seem like you always need an internet guide to play Final Fantasy 1, but I also refuse to justify these plain broken spells. What happens if you innocently fill up your inventory with broken or minimally useful spells? You'll end up dragging through every dungeon if you miss something important, and may even have to restart the entire game just to fix the mistake. One restart wouldn't hurt me, but what about someone on original hardware who had to puzzle through the entire game and probably has 40 plus hours? It's not productive either way. Anyway, quite a lot of information to take in at the first magic store. To summarize, some of the spells are completely broken, and whatever you learn is permanent. Keep this in mind as you select spells for your mages, and do your research. Once you've spent your allowance on weapons, armor, and spells, you probably won't have enough for items. Don't worry, there are plenty of monsters to fight for cash right outside of Coneria, and if you need to heal, just spend a little bit of that money at that inn. Thing is, your eventual goals in Final Fantasy 1 are always hinted at by the NPCs, so I recommend talking to everyone and writing down what they say. This will become vastly more important in the future when you're allowed to access the entire world and need to backtrack. Make sure to stop in Coneria Castle while you're getting your money back. You'll learn the first part of the story after talking to the residents. Princess Sarda of Coneria has been kidnapped by the knight Garland, and it's up to you to rescue her. Sounds generic, especially since popular Nintendo franchises use the same plotline in their earlier games, such as Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. Not much else is in the castle except for 2 locked rooms that require the Mystic Key. Make note of these locked rooms early in the game. They're super important, even if they're annoying to encounter. Then you're off. The only place to go is the ruined castle in the north. Along the way you'll fight very weak imps and slightly stronger ponies. In doing so, you'll foray into the battle system. The battle screen looks very similar to a board game, which is what it was based off of. Your 4 characters are on the right side of the screen, along with their names and health. The bigger screen on the left is where the enemies are. All your actions during battle appear at the bottom of the screen for you to cycle through. At the top of the screen, there's a little border which shows what biome you're fighting in, purely for decorative purposes. You're given 5 options: to fight, use magic, drink, use an item, or run from battle. Drink may seem like a strange option, but it is actually for potions. Later games would just compile the drink option and the item option into a single thing. The person that you are deciding the action for steps forwards, then back when you've selected your option. You can also cancel an action for a character and go back to the last character in case you choose what you don't want. I like that there are plenty of clever things that you can perform with such little options. If you attempt to back out of choosing an option from your first character, your cursor will go back to the fight option, and your first character will backpedal before stepping up again. You can also choose to cast spells or give drinks to other party members, which is especially useful if you dedicate one of your members to carry items or heal the others. Using items in a fight won't become useful until much later in the game. Something else that would become important the further you go into the game: the order of the characters in your party matters. Whoever's first in line has the greatest chance of getting hit by a single target attack from an enemy, then the second in line, and etc. I recommend putting your mages in the back and your fighters in front. Black belts should also go near the back of the line, since they can't wear much armor. Basically, whoever has the most defense should go first. One thing I don't like, though, is that your party order gets rearranged whenever a member is poisoned or petrified. Usually, if your highest defense warrior gets poisoned and is moved to the back, if you forget to fix it before your next battle, your weakest member will be taking all the hits. It's a small annoyance which requires a quick change every time it happens. Note here that there is one controversial part of the battle system concerning the target selection. If you target an enemy with multiple characters, and the enemy dies before all of them have finished attacking, the rest of the attacks will be nullified. While this does add an element of strategy to the game, as you must choose wisely how to divide your team's damage potential across multiple enemies, this also requires that you know instinctively how much health the enemies have and their weaknesses. By the end of the game, you understand your party well enough to disperse your targets evenly, but in the beginning of the game, it can be quite annoying. What may be strange in the beginning of the game is that your characters seem to miss frequently. Don't misconstrue the hit percent stat for each of your characters as abysmal, though. There is a different purpose as to why the hit percent is so low for each character. One of the key mechanics in this game is that you can possibly land blows more than once in a single turn. The greater your hit percent increases as you level up your character, the greater chance that you will hit an enemy more than once. In the late game, this mechanic eventually becomes extremely busted as you manage to hit your enemies upwards of 5 times unaided, especially with the Black Belt class. That means that whatever arbitrary damage value you rolled for that character has just been multiplied by however many times you hit an enemy. Consequently, the same system works for enemies as well. Another thing you may notice is that some of your characters take 1 damage per attack, consistently. This is directly related to the absorption stat your character has, which can be increased by wearing armor. An enemy will hit your character, for example, and the amount of damage it does is the result of your character's absorption value being directly subtracted from the original enemy damage roll. This actual damage must be non-zero, so if your absorption value is greater than the enemy's damage output, the result is just a single damage point to your character. Status effects on your characters also have a chance to do absolutely nothing if your situation is right. For example, poison damage only takes effect at the end of each full round. So, if you can manage to end the fight before your team and the enemy has finished attacking, you won't take any poison damage at all. Just be sure to cure the poison when you get back to the overworld, or else you'll be hearing this fantastic sound while walking. I wonder if other poison effects from other games such as Pokemon drew inspiration from this. You may also notice that your magic spells have a limited number of uses. Each level has a certain number of uses that will increase as your character levels up, which each level capped at 9 uses. Higher grades of magic require more powerful mages, meaning that you won't be able to use, for example, a level 8 spell without first leveling up greatly to unlock a point for it. The magic points per level can't be restored without using either an inn or a house. That means that you should save your magic until you really need it. Once you run out, you're out for good. One last note to make is that there is a clear separation between magical attacks and melee attacks. Melee attacks work against basically every single enemy in the game, except for those that have a high evade stat, in which case your character will miss, wasting a turn. Magic attacks will pretty much always hit, but have a chance of being ineffective, or being cancelled out by the elemental weaknesses. In the later game, the elements you use become critical to taking down each enemy, but in this part of the game, all you need to worry about are undead enemies. They are weak to fire, and the White Mage's specialty, Holy Magic. To use the Holy Magic for a White Mage, grab the Harm spell from Coneria. Alright, that's quite a lot of information. There really won't be a need to go over the combat system in depth again, so we'll get moving. After preparing all of your spells, armor, weapons, and items, it's time to confront the Princess Kidnapper Garland in the Temple of Fiends. This is the shortest dungeon in the game by far. If you wanted, you could walk down the stairs, walk the 7 or so tiles into the center room, defeat Garland, and get a move on with it. Honestly, you don't need to be super powerful to beat him anyway. In the midst of grinding for money, you'll probably be level 3 or level 4, and that's plenty enough to beat him. He only has 106 hit points and can inflict 30 damage points at worst. If you do take your time in the temple, however, you'll find treasure in corners of the floor and random encounter enemies that give a good bit of experience. It's a good rehearsal, I'll say. It's hard to judge how powerful you need to be in this little dungeon. The progression is a bit more linear as the game continues, assuming you follow the game's set order of events. I really just recommend getting the best equipment you can in Coneria. Then the enemy grinding that you did to obtain that equipment will produce enough XP to be ready for Garland. You could also farm for money and experience in the little section before Garland, though I wouldn't recommend it since you'll have to either walk back to Coneria for a heal or use a tent outside the dungeon to restore your health and save your progress. Money is already scarce at this point. You don't want to be spending it on tents this early. You'll also hear one of the 3 repeating dungeon tracks playing now. A handful of the dungeons much later in the game will have unique tracks, but this track is one of the few you'll be hearing a lot. I'll present the other themes as they appear in the game. You get teleported back after Princess Sarda thanks you, and then receive congratulations from the King of Coneria, who builds a bridge for your party to cross over to the next part of the game. The princess also gives you the loot, which is an item that you seriously will not need until the literal end of the game. Inventory space for items isn't pressing, though it's nice to stay organized. Bear this in mind when you pick up the loot. Then it's time to cross the bridge, and on the bridge you're introduced to a cutscene and the credit sequence. There's actually no credits at the end of the game, it's just here in the beginning. What, did you think that Garland was going to be the end of the game? Of course not. You've only seen 2% of the map at this point. There's a lot more to play. You head across the land, fighting some slightly stronger enemies, and end up at the next town. There's really no direction of the game at this moment, at least it isn't clear beyond restoring the 4 orbs. You could go north to Matoya's cave and grab a couple supplies, but you're better off just heading into the next town. You show up to the next town east of Coneria and find out that it has been taken over by pirates. Seriously, before you do anything, just beat up the pirates in town. They're really easy to beat, especially if you use a group effect spell such as Sleep. You're also introduced to the beginning of the greatest text boxes in the entire game, with the number 1 contender being the very first person you talk to in Pravoka. This is, I'm gonna assume this is... Now the next thing I'd like to talk about is the topic of money. Truthfully, money is only an early game concern. At the end of the game, you'll be so full of money that you won't know what to do with it. But here, back in Coneria, and in the next town, you'll be starved for funding. I really didn't know how prepared my characters had to be in the future, so I did the same thing that I did in Coneria. Stayed at the inn, then walked out to the few grass patches right outside town to farm some enemies. My best guess was that the best equipment in each town was basically required. The only couple things that you really need to buy from Pravoka are the level 2 white magic spell A-Lit, which will be important later, possibly the level 2 black magic spell Slow, and the short swords. You absolutely need to, however, get rid of the pirates. Once you do, the captain of the pirates hands over his entire ship to your party. This is one of 2 major modes of transport in the game. Remember that weird inlet in Coneria surrounded by bricks? Well, the ship that you won from the pirate captain can only park in those ports. In the starting game area, there are only 4 ports for you to dock your ship. In front of Coneria, in front of Pravoka, above the forest of Elfheim, and northwest of Coneria. By the way, once you've finished the quick quest line of Pravoka, head southwest to the forest port and hike through the forest to Elfheim. Welcome to probably the best town in the entire game. It's got every commodity you need, a clear quest line, a good bit of the most useful magic spells in the entire game, and all that for pretty cheap prices. Honestly, the things you want to buy from Elfland seem super expensive, but if you collect some money from the incoming second dungeon, you'll be set. These items are expensive for a reason, because they're so good. There's a lot going on in the elf castle. The prince is asleep and needs the herb to awaken, and there's the dark elf Astos taking over. If you recall Coneria's NPC lines, you'll remember one of them saying that the elves have the mystic key, which you absolutely cannot pass up. So of course, it's time to help the elves. Just make sure you talk to all of them though. The towns onward from Elfheim usually have something on the outskirts that is crucial to your progress, so make sure to check all sides of each town for anything required. You can't continue the game anywhere else but the next dungeon, but there are a couple more places that you can go. The fourth port, almost directly north of Elfheim, a little bit to the western side though, leads to the Dwarf Cave. If you go early, you can net yourself 1,000 gil and learn about a lot of endgame quest items. There is also the ruined castle far northwest of Elfheim, where a lost king is desperate for his crown. The crown is in the dungeon southwest of Elfheim, so it's in your best interest to just go to the dungeon straight after gathering resources from these 2 extra places. Once you gather all of your information from these other locations, your order of events should look something like this. Did you get all that? When I was playing through this game, I most certainly did not. I knew vaguely that I had to end up in the dungeon at some point, but most of these things I just found by wandering around. The information is all there, found by talking to the various NPCs in Elfheim and the Dwarf Cave. Again, pencil and paper will help massively as you play. That, and it's impossible to go anywhere else new until you complete this questline anyway. Eventually I wandered around enough to figure out the right way. That isn't such a terrible thing for early game in particular, because it isn't super far from one location to another, but I have some annoyances that I want to point out later on when the full map is accessible. Let's get a move on and tackle the first real dungeon of the game. After buying a couple heals and pures from Elfheim, I headed over to Marsh Cave. This dungeon will be a real pain in the neck if you didn't prepare correctly. The enemies are tough and the route progression is tougher. Poison is a massive problem in this dungeon, so come prepared with at least 20 pure potions. This would end up being one of 3 dungeons I played without a map. It feels like something from a tabletop RPG, which, again, was the inspiration. There are a lot of dead ends. Most of the enemies in here are undead. If you came prepared with Fire 2 or Harm 2, you'll do just fine. If not, but you're around level 10, you'll do just fine. Or, if you did all the work to get a silver sword, this will be a cakewalk. If you didn't do any of that, and decided to just follow the questline, you'll get handed a game over on a silver platter. Seriously, a good bit of time spent just fighting random enemies either outside of Marsh Cave or right at the entrance of it does wonders. This also begins a trend where some of a dungeon's enemies are far more dangerous than others. When I walked into Marsh Cave for the first time, I was sent packing by a group of skeletons. A greater skeleton can accompany other skeletons in a fight, and this skeleton has a lot of health and strong damage. My advice is to not be discouraged. Sometimes it's productive to run away from a fight that will do more harm to you than good. Not all of the dungeon's encounters are so difficult. There is also plenty of variable map design in these dungeons, some good, some bad. My least favorite trend in these dungeons is a large square floor with a bunch of little rooms arranged in a grid. It's a lot of travel time, a lot of encounters, and honestly not all of the rooms have something good in them. Even sometimes it's the only way to move forwards, and you'll be checking every room until you finally reach the right one. The Marsh Cave unfortunately falls victim to this trope on its last floor, whilst its first couple floors have a cool snake-like design. The only bad thing about this dungeon besides the onerous last floor has to be the boss fight. This will be a trend in the future. Bear in mind that some of the boss fights won't seem like boss fights. Not all of them are initiated by interacting with an object. Sometimes, you'll just step on a tile in front of a chest and find yourself facing a mini-boss. Sometimes, you'll just be on your way through a dungeon, step on a forced encounter tile, and suddenly be faced with the eldritch horror residing in the dungeon. Just assume that every chest in every dungeon may have some sort of forced encounter tile with a slightly harder than average fight behind it. That, and take one tile hallways cautiously. The boss fight for Marsh Cave's quest item, however, is especially difficult. You're faced with 2 to 4 wizard enemies, which have quite a lot of defense and hit really hard. In my playthrough, I fought 4, and I was so out of resources by the end of the fight that I didn't bother to loot the rest of the dungeon. I just left. My advice is to take them out one by one, as you can't keep tanking the damage from all of them. They're not vulnerable to any spell, so just use ice as it's the best base magic damage you have. Then, once you get the crown, you have to walk all the way back out. If you are out of resources after the wizard fight, you're in for a rough time trying to get back out. Plus, at this point in the game, the only way to revive anyone is still using the clinic in a town, so you've got a monumental task ahead. Add the fact that you haven't saved since possibly using a tent outside of the dungeon's entrance, and you've got a recipe for potential disaster. Every fight trying to claw back up out of Marsh Cave is tense. In these cases, it may be more productive to grab as much treasure as you can on a separate trip from attempting the boss. Let's go over two things that I think are oversights. First off, if you're going to fight a boss triggered by a force encounter tile, that tile doesn't shut off when you win. If you wish to pass the same space again, you also need to fight the boss. This is a big issue, especially in the last dungeon of the game, and for certain areas that have many chests cramped into a single room. If you make the wrong move, you could be fighting a mini-boss all over again. It's a waste of resources. The second thing is really only a problem in this dungeon. There are multi-opportunity chests, where there is one item spread across multiple chests. If you collect the item at any of these chests, then the rest in the series will be considered empty. It's another waste of time, especially considering how little of these multi-chests are in the late game dungeons, as compared to this one. One last thing of note in this dungeon. There are a couple rooms on the bottom row of the last floor that require the mystic key to open. Remember, the questline requires the crown from this dungeon long before you're given the key. The treasure inside is not really worth going back for, simply because you can obtain the treasure from those extra rooms for free in much safer and less time-consuming ways. The silver dagger can be found either in one of Castle Coneria's locked rooms or in the Dwarf Cave, and the silver bracelet can be bought at the next town. There's also 1,000 gil in the Marsh Cave extra rooms, but seriously, at this point, you have a nice enough bit of dungeon money. I left Marsh Cave with almost 10,000 gil. With the crown in hand, it's time to pay a visit to the distraught king in the Western Keep. Just like the first dungeon, all you really need to do here is take a short walk up to the target NPC. But, as soon as you hand the king his missing crown, he reveals that he was the monster that was torturing the elves. You're launched into the first real boss fight representative of Marsh Cave. Astos is heavily a luck-based fight. He is one of the first enemies in the game that is able to cast Rub, which is extremely dangerous until you're able to grab Prot Rings a few towns in the future. It has a chance to instantly down one of your members. The enemy spellcasting in Final Fantasy I works as follows. Each enemy has a certain chance to cast spells every turn, and if that chance is satisfied, the enemy will start at the beginning of its spell list and cast that move. So, if Astos doesn't fulfill the % chance to cast magic during a turn, he'll just hit one of your characters, causing a pretty inconsequential amount of damage. If you went back to town to resupply after Marsh Cave and grabbed some silver weapons while you were at it, you'll be well equipped to deal with Astos. I had no trouble with him, especially considering all the grinding I did before exploring the dungeon. Once Astos has been defeated, it was time to continue the questline to Matoya's cave in the north. This is probably the only time you'll ever go to this part of the map. You could have come here beforehand for a couple free chests during the Pravoka segment of your playthrough, but the rewards are middling. It would be just a quick trip to memorize the location. You need to give the crystal you won from the Dark Lord Astos to Matoya in exchange for the herb. One quick little side quest and you're done. Reminds me of some Zelda games. Maybe this was the first to introduce the potion-making witch trope in those games. A broom in Matoya's cave also tells you how to access the in-game map by holding down B and pushing select. I never ended up using the in-game map though. Afterwards, you sail your ship back to Elfheim and wake the Elf Prince. He then finally grants you the Mystic Key. At the point that you earn the key, the rewards inside of the key rooms are still quite good, only truly depending on your travel time. The only place not worth going back to for the key rooms would be Marsh Cave, as the silver bracelet, silver dagger, and the 1,000 gil can be obtained from other key rooms. The Western Keep even had some key rooms with decent treasure, although it's guarded. But your main goal is to go back to Coneria Castle and obtain the TNT from the locked rooms. Once you have that, if you had been scoping out the area, you may remember that there was a dwarf in the Dwarf Cave digging a canal. I can't think of a single reason why half of the dwarves just say hooray. I don't know what they're cheering for. Then again, I went there after defeating Astos, so maybe their dialogue was different. There's some treasure to be had here, which makes for good money later, but the silver dagger is probably the best weapon your black mage is going to get. Of course, unless you have 65,000 gil lying around. Nedrick, who lives in the southernmost house in Dwarf Cave, is the one you want. He takes your TNT and blasts open a one-block area on the map, which is just enough for your ship to pass into the whole map proper. Now that the whole map is open, you can visit a whole bunch of places out of order. There is still a correct way to go, but it's possible to visit a bunch of sub-areas much earlier than intended. I only deviated from the natural order once during the last 3 dungeons. The right way to go immediately after opening the canal, though, is north to the next port and head into Melmond. Melmond is a contender for the worst town in the game, simply because there isn't an item shop in Melmond when the next dungeon demands it. What's saving Melmond from being the worst are 2 things: the level 5 magic stores and the necessary NPC information. Melmond is your first intended town after leaving the early game Aiden Ocean, so the only way you're going to learn about any of the new areas would be here. Life, possibly the most important white magic spell next to Cure 4, can also be purchased here. If you don't have a white mage in your party to get life, save a level 5 slot. You absolutely must. Remember that it is one of the very few ways to revive any of your party members, and pretty much the only way inside of a dungeon. If you don't have life in the future, you'll be playing a very tense game, especially now that some enemies are capable of casting instant death spells. Your next task is to explore the next dungeon, the Earth Cave. It's pretty hard to glean that from the residents of Melmond, though, because there is another small quest intertwined with the progression of the Earth Cave. Most of the residents will say something along the lines of, "The Titan likes rubies," but it's hard to get directions. Better to wander around, since you may need a couple more levels before tackling the Earth Cave. Last piece of advice concerning Melmond: don't buy the steel armor. You don't need it. You will never need it. And there's a good replacement for it not far in the future. There's no need for you to sink so much money into something that will be completely irrelevant in the next hour or so. After buying a couple heal potions and a few softs way back in Elfheim, it's time for the next dungeon. Welcome to a pretty good dungeon with plenty of content to keep you entertained. There's something on every floor that's new, mostly very out of the ordinary for the other dungeons in this game. Most of the item treasure is not great, though this is the first place in the game where you can start making all sorts of money. Not only is there a collective 27,050 gil to find in the chests, but the group battles can sometimes give over 1,000 gil alone. And, right on the first floor, is one of the funniest things in the entire game. This little section of the map on the left, although not required, is perfect for farming XP and gil if you don't have enough. Why? because every single tile in this corridor is a forced encounter tile. Each encounter includes a giant which hit pretty hard but are well worth the effort with 879 experience and gil drop per enemy. You could work up a fortune just in this little area alone. What's funny about it though is that there's no mention of this spot in the entire game. You could walk into it accidentally, keep going without recognizing the frequency of battles, and just be buried in giants. Most hallways in this dungeon are short anyway. This could be a long dungeon, but only if you collect all the gold in the treasure rooms. The only treasure worth not skipping would be the coral sword in the northeastern corner of the second basement. Even if its stats are equal to the silver sword, it's still free money. Each treasure chest in this dungeon is guarded by an earth enemy, who will usually take a big chunk of someone's HP before it dies. Every chest in the earth cave requires some blood spilled, basically. If you're worried about forced encounters with chests, I recommend trying to access each chest from the side. Usually, a forced encounter is in a predictable spot where you can open multiple chests from one tile. The third basement, though, is actually dangerous. If you've been able to handle normal enemies, that's great, but now there's a 9% chance that you'll encounter a Cotrice. They're not very difficult enemies to beat, but they can petrify your party. You better had brought at least 5 soft potions to this dungeon, because the only other way to get rid of the stone status is to use the soft spell, which is both expensive and not available yet. Considering how scarce money was before the Earth dungeon, you probably won't have many softs to spare. You can also encounter wizards on this floor of the dungeon, however, you're much more powerful than them at this point. It's nice to be able to defeat an enemy that was much tougher when underleveled beforehand. You meet the boss of the Earth Cave here, the Vampire. The only thing the Vampire has going for him is that he has a good bit of melee damage. That and he can stun your party. Literally just burn him. That's all you need to do. If you have fire too, burn him. Easy money. You obtain the ruby from the Vampire, and the by far worst part of the Earth Caves becomes clear. Now that you have the quest item, you have to walk all of the way out. Take solace knowing, though, that this will be the last time. On the bright side, you can gain a bit more experience and gil on your way out, but it's still a bit of an extra time sink. I guess that's just up to the player whether they enjoy the walkout or not. Like, if you're enjoying the game, you probably won't mind the extra 5 minutes, plus it'll be a bit more exciting since you'll be lower on resources. You won't have to open any treasure chests on your way out either. Once you leave the Earth Cave, use a tent or cabin or house or whatever you have and head west. While we're on the topic, let me quick say something about tents, cabins, and houses. I find it strange that there are 3 different versions of the same thing, which the tent and cabin don't have that great a difference. When using one of these on the world map, you can save your game, and depending on which one you use, you'll receive certain benefits. The tent restores 30 hit points, the cabin restores 60, and the house restores 120, along with all of your magic charges. I just think that by the second half of the game where you can get to a dungeon quickly, you won't need to use any magic to defend yourself before the dungeon, and you won't lose much health either. Besides, I'm sure you will have just left an inn. It's more effective to use a tent later on, unless, well, if you're leaving a dungeon. Maybe it has a better point beyond how I played through the game, because once I entered a dungeon, I barely ever left. But I still think there should be a one-size-fits-all shelter. I really don't have anything to say about this. If you came in here before grabbing the ruby from Earth Cave, sucks. Just fork over the ruby and get a move on. This is the only time you're ever going to be here. Honestly, I wish you could have just had the Titan give you the rod, because at this point you're still in the progress of completing the Earth Cave, and the sooner you can re-enter that dungeon the better. It's also one of the only yellow areas in the game. So this time you have to walk back down, only you'll find that most of your time collecting treasure is what made the Earth Cave seem so long. The actual straight route takes 1/5 of the time. Now you can use the rod to break the seal on the extra stairway and head deeper into the dungeon. Turns out that one vampire wasn't strong enough to cause this much damage to the land in Melmond. The 4th basement is nothing special except for more Cotrices and slightly stronger enemies. If you fought the giants on the first floor, this should be nothing new. Just make sure to grab the silver shield directly south of the floor's start. After that, it's a straight shot to the actual boss of the Earth Cave, the Lich. The rooms that have the boss spawns are usually decorated and are nice to look at. I also like the dialogue that precedes the boss fight because it usually describes some sort of effect of spawning the boss, which plays on your imagination. The Lich is really not a hard boss. If you use fast or fire spells, you can beat him super quickly, as he only has 400 hit points. He doesn't even hit that hard either, only a maximum of 80 hit points. As long as you healed before starting this fight or got some of the elemental shield spells, you should be well able to tank the Lich's Ice 2. The rest of the Lich's spells are either not great for damage, such as Light 2 or Fire 2, or just annoying status effects like Sleep. Once he's beaten, you step on the altar and a huge gray rhombus flies out from it. I assume that it is the evil being cast out of the element, and for the NES it's not a bad effect. Though, with the power of imagination, I think that effect may have a different meaning for others. That's the beauty of Final Fantasy I. It's different for everyone. Walk another tile forwards and you'll be teleported to the entrance of the Earth Cave. One of your orbs has finally been revived. Now that you've beaten the Lich, you can move to another area with your leveled up characters. You can't progress the game without completing the Earth Cave first, but the other areas are, as before, always open. This was about the time that I started using a world map to keep track of where I was. Back in the 90s, I guess the people who played this probably drew their own maps, which is nice to think about. Again, pencil and paper makes this game much more comprehensive. Hopefully when you leave the Earth Cave, you'll have the most money you've ever had in the entire game. When I left, I had a stunning 41,993 gil. So now, head further west until the screen wraps around and you end up on the east side of the world. It's also a really nice effect as it makes the world seem infinite. Dock your ship on the outcropping port and head south to Crescent Lake. One last thing about sailing, though. I found out after finishing the game that you can dock your ship at the mouth of a river, too. It's a little cute optimization to get to some places faster in the mid-game. And if you thought rivers were annoying because they blocked you from walking directly to where you wish to go, don't worry anymore. Crescent Lake has something to say about that. This is a useful town, though you'll only be here for the next 2 dungeons, especially since this is where the inns and other commodities get expensive. Before you do anything else though, head to the northern end of town and into the forest. There, you'll find the Circle of Sages. They fill you in on a bit more story material. The 4 elements of the world had lost their control when 4 Fiends took control of them. Your team of 4 had just defeated the Lich, the Fiend of Earth. 3 of these Fiends remain, found in the following place: the Fire Fiend in Gulgu Volcano, the Water Fiend in the Sunken Shrine, and the Wind Fiend in the Floating Castle. The sages are your best guides as to the natural progression of the game because they will tell you what your end goal is for that section of the game. They're also useful because they hand over the canoe. Congratulations, rivers are now no longer impassable. They act the same as ground tiles now, except that your character sprite changes to a little canoe. While in Crescent Lake, make sure to stop by the level 6 magic stores. Keep note of the spells here. Something major has been set in motion by your arrival at Crescent Lake, and these spells will be obtainable when you've completed that major thing. I'll keep it unspoiled until it happens. If you have a white mage, though, grab the spell Fog 2. When you reach Crescent Lake, you have a few choices as to where you want to go next. You could head directly for the next Fiend, which is up the river maze from Crescent Lake, or you could go further north to the other river maze and explore the Ice Cave. Either way, the enemies you must face are difficult. The enemies on the river tiles are styled for post-Earth Cave warriors, so they'll take a decent chunk of your health too. Honestly though, they're not worth fighting. The Hydras, maybe, but the Caribs, not worth their salt. I chose to head straight for Gulgu Volcano after reaching Crescent Lake. I can't tell if I like this dungeon or not. There's a lot of fun things, and there's a lot of abysmal things about it. This dungeon is all about greed. If you want its treasure, you have to work for it. If you go straight for the end, just like the Earth Cave, then you can reach it effortlessly. Either way, you should definitely have a dungeon map for this one. This was the first time that I generally had to stop and check where I needed to go with a map. Some of the floors in this dungeon are pretty cool looking, and some are just maze hells. Especially the third basement. It's hard to tell where you're going because I assume that every player wants to intuitively avoid taking damage where it isn't necessary. And where might you be taking damage, you ask? All over the floor, of course. There are magma tiles that deal 1 HP every time you step on one, so if you screw up and go the wrong way, you may lose 20 HP or more. Plus, there's some pathways that are impossible to reach without trekking through some magma. Every single floor has a part where lava damage is unavoidable. It's not like in this point of the game you have enough HP to spare for all these lava tiles, at least now. That, and the average encounters hit like a truck. Not only do the enemies here have melee damage up to 50 HP at base value, but some of the common enemies are capable of casting their own special spells which will deal damage to your whole group. Enemies like the Cerebus and Agama can cast Scorch and Heat, which are also a pain in the neck. There are still forced encounter tiles in front of some of the chests too, inciting a battle with a fire elemental or a gray worm that isn't actually gray. Put that on top of all of the damage tiles and you realize quickly that Gulgu Volcano is one hell of an endurance challenge. The treasure here has some merit. It may be worth emptying the second floor and leaving the dungeon to recuperate due to just how much treasure there is in that floor alone. There's plenty of silver gear to be had which, if you didn't purchase any in Crescent Lake, is worth getting here. If you delve deeper after opening all the treasure on the second floor, assuming it would be the extent of the lava and tiles and enemy difficulty, well, I have news for you. This is the part that I really don't like about this dungeon. You don't have HP to spare to explore all of the dungeon, and you'll have to leave the dungeon if you so much as take one wrong turn. It's more lava tiles, more encounters, and while some of the arrangements of the floors look cool and are easy to follow, such as the first hallway of the third basement, the later parts are just unnecessary. The mazes just get worse and worse. Even if this is an exercise in greed, there is one treasure you absolutely should not skip. In the northwestern corner of the fourth basement's second set of corridors, there is an ice sword. Do not miss this. The ice sword is going to be your go-to sword for the next 20% of the game. You'll only get a better sword when you enter the second to last dungeon. The last floor is even more of an example of why a map is especially useful for this specific dungeon. You're given 8 rooms to explore, 1 on each corner inside of the 5th basement, and only 1 has the boss. The other rooms have multi-purpose chests like in the Marsh Cave, so if you did your looting earlier, there's no reason to explore. Except, of course, to get the flame armor in the western room. It's a small upgrade that if you have enough health, you should get it. Speaking of health, I, however, was on my last rope. I had run out of cures, out of healing potions, and all of my characters were under 100 health except for my fighter. I couldn't afford the forced encounter with the fire dragon for the flame armor. I attempted the recovery of the flame armor with a save state, resulting in a game over. The only way I was leaving this dungeon was either getting a game over or defeating the boss, and I would have to come back later for the flame armor. The boss is in the southwestern room. You break the crystal ball open and the boss, Carrie, admonishes you for defeating Lish before attacking you. Carrie is an average difficulty boss on her own, but after the entire Gulgu Volcano, she is a beast. I definitely didn't have the health to put up with her devastating attacks. She'll either just keep casting Fire 2, of which a fire would be the best spell here, or slice your team apart. During her turn, she'll hit one of your characters 6 times for 40 to 80 damage, and that extra damage adds up. This is the only boss in the game that took me a few tries, and I think it wouldn't have if I just sprinted straight to the boss room from the entrance. But, luckily for me, my fighter pulled through. headed back to Crescent Lake to lick my wounds. The second orb had been restored. I was ready for some more exciting battles, but it's too bad that the next task in line is my least favorite in the entire game and would deliver no excitement of the sort. Worst dungeon in the game by far. Level 19 might be exaggerated, but honestly, it doesn't matter what level you enter this dungeon if you can easily defeat a few wizards. It's the enemies in this dungeon that are terrible. You have at least a 1 in 2 chance of every encounter containing an enemy that can petrify you or just defeat you instantly. There are 3 enemies in this dungeon alone that can accomplish one of those things: the Cotrace, the Sorcerer, and the Mage. The rest of the enemies are either super annoying, such as the Image, or really strong, such as the Great Pede. By the way, I've been saving to talk about something until this late in the game, which is the usefulness of the Heal Potion. They're the only source of non-magic healing you're going to get between battles in the dungeon, and while they're fine for the early game, eventually your characters begin to amass hundreds of hit points. The heal potions only ever restore 30 HP outside of battle, so if you want your character in the best shape for the next battle, you have to heal, then heal, then heal, then heal, then heal, 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 heal. That's every time after a battle, and it gets annoying this far into the game. Not to mention that you have to buy all of the potions in the first place. Money for items is not a problem this late in the game because most of the encounters will earn you 1500 gil, but actually buying all of the potions takes a long time. Besides heal potions, you'll never need as many pure potions or soft potions. Don't bother wasting time maxing out soft potions, you'll never run through them. Pures though, maybe. The last couple dungeons are heavy on poison. Anyway, it's another grievance on top of the grievance that is the Ice Cavern. My advice: the only treasure that's worth spending any more time in the Ice Cavern for is the Ice Armor set. There's a chest plate and a shield. They'll be good if you didn't get the Flame Armor. Your main goal, though, is the floater in the middle chest of the first area. Guarding the floater is the Eye. Remember how I said 3 of the enemies in the Ice Cavern can either petrify you or defeat you instantly? Well, guess what? This idiot can do both and more. The Eye has 5 separate attacks that can literally just end one of your characters. What's even worse is that the first spell that the Eye casts is XXXX, or just 4X. This is a power word spell, and they have their own brand of danger. There are only 3 spells in the game that are power word spells, and none of the 3 are especially useful to you this late in the game. Their hit probability is different than normal spells. They will 100% hit your target if the target is below 300 health points. So before you touch the forced encounter tile in front of the floater chest, heal your characters. If their max health is below 300 and they get hit by 4x, oh well, too bad, they're dead. You simply just have to defeat the Eye before it defeats you. It only has 162 health points, so if you're powerful enough, you can stamp it out in one shot. I recommend doing the volcano first because at least you can reliably grind for experience before progressing. In the Ice Cavern, you literally can just lose because the enemies felt like it. There is a singular good thing I'll say about the Ice Cavern. The map design is pretty good. And that's it. That's the best thing I can say about the Ice Cavern. You'll get plenty of money too, but you'll have to fight tooth and nail for it. I left that place with a combined wallet of the Volcano and Ice Cavern money totaling 193,749 gil. Before the next part of the game, I have a sin to admit to. I missed the floater when I entered the Ice Cavern for the first time. I wasn't keeping track of what floor I was on, so I simply passed the required hole in the floor by. I may have earned an extra 20,000 gil in that case, but that doesn't excuse that you have to walk through the bottom floor twice, even if you don't grab the floater. So after one pretty good dungeon and one terrible one, I had 2 orbs lit and a levitating rock. This moment right here is finally the time for pencil and paper to come in handy. I also admit that I did not have notes and wander around for quite a while before I remembered this too. There was an elf in Elfheim that mentioned the floater, and if you ask him about it, he'll tell you to use it in a small desert south of Crescent Lake. Do as he says, and you unearth the greatest thing in the game, which makes the ice cavern torture all worth it. The airship is essential to continuing the game because you simply can't find a port on the northern islands to park your pirate ship. There isn't a river either, but now you could just fly everywhere. No need to pay extra for expensive inns either. Just fly back to Coneria and stay at the cheap one there. I mean, at this point in the game, money should be your least concern. Ice Cavern and Gulgu Volcano were worth plenty anyway. But now you have access to the entire map and everything on it. There is a singular downside to using the airship, and it is that the airship is also subject to parking issues. The airship can only be parked on a place with 0 obstructions. It can be put down on a solid green tile, on a prairie tile, or not at all. You can't put it down on sand, on wetlands, on mountains, or water. I guess it makes sense, but this fact was used to change how you must approach the northern continent. Since you can't land on obstructions, literally all of the structures on the northern continent are surrounded by obstructions, except for the Gaia village. You have to search for a good square to put your airship down, then hike in to enter the place you need. I wouldn't recommend going to a place on the map unless you're sure you can 100% it, because you don't earn enough to justify the constant foot travel in and out of these places. With the entire map open, there are many places to go, but the game still has an intended route that I recommend sticking to since the new areas are difficult. Stick to your notes and NPC information in the new towns. The first place you should visit is the town directly south of the airship's desert due to screen wrapping, known as the town Gaia. Don't bother staying in the inn or using the clinic in Gaia. It costs 10 times more than the first inn in the game, and with your airship you can literally just fly back. In fact, barely buy anything in Gaia. Everything here is worth tens of thousands of gil. I know I said that money is the least concern, but tens of thousands is a lot. The best thing you should do here is get armor for your characters. In the course of the game, you've probably run into your fair share of enemies that turned your mages into mush because they refused to wear any sort of armor. But here's your chance to change that. This is a pretty good time to talk about armor. It's super useful to have characters with tons of armor, as they'll be able to absorb most damage, save for critical hits, and turn it into a single lost health point. There are 4 different kinds of armor that your character can wear: head, right hand, body, and left hand. There's a certain type of armor for one hand, so you can't equip 2 shields at the same time. More armor means that your character can't dodge as well, which is pretty realistic. Just like weapons, not all classes can equip the same armor. If you have a black mage on your team, you'll find quickly that the only pieces of armor you can get for them would be the cap or the gloves. But here in Gaia, there's something else: the prot ring. It's very much worth the 20,000 gil price because everyone can wear it and it gives 8 free armor points. The prot ring also stops the attacks that instantly defeat you. It's something that would have been greatly appreciated back in the ice cavern. Your mages, if they can't wear body armor, can instead wear bracelets. Bracelets don't take the space of the prot ring and are supremely useful because they offer plenty of armor points with little invasion penalty. That is where all your current funds from the last 2 dungeons should go. There's something more important to obtain soon after this. I imagine that Gulgu Volcano and the ice cavern were really tough. You could just grind, but there's a better thing to do instead. If you used your airship to travel around the world and see what else there is to offer, you may have noticed a bunch of islands with random holes in them to the north. These are the Cardia Islands, and this is where the dragons live. Cardia is one of the better looking areas in the game, and I like how Bahamut's temple looks. It's a bit similar to Matoya's cave from much earlier. There's some treasure to be found here, and you can talk to the dragons, but they don't say much of consequence. The one dragon you do want, though, is Bahamut. His temple is on the northernmost island in the lower hole. He asks for an offering of your courage to be honored, so you must take it upon yourself to enter the Castle of Ordeals to the east. The Castle of Ordeal is a bit of a letdown. The enemies you will face while traveling there include the abominable Ankylo, which serves a ridiculous amount of physical damage to your characters and only drops 1 gil upon death. But when you get into the actual castle, the most threatening enemy you can run into are sorcerers, which if you bought the prot rings in Gaia, are completely helpless against you. Other than that, there are medusas which can petrify you, but if you bring a handful of softs, that's no problem either. Basically, if you take these couple extra steps to guard yourself against the dangers that plagued the past couple dungeons, especially with the new equipment, then whatever comes next will be a pushover. The Castle of Ordeal becomes trivial. Even the new enemy guarding the treasure chests, the Nightmare, isn't that difficult if you use the ice spells on them. The map design of the castle is a bit annoying. On the second floor of the castle, there is a teleporter maze where you walk into pillars and hopefully are teleported to the next section. If you don't know the route through that room, then you'll be in there for quite a while. However, in light of the teleporter maze, there is something legendary that you pick up out of a treasure chest in the castle, the Zeus Gauntlet. This will be your first magic weapon if you deign to grab it, and it is so powerful simply because it requires 0 magic points to use. The magic weapons have a predetermined spell attached to them, which can be casted constantly with 0 consequences. The Zeus Gauntlet has Lightning 2 attached, which is a critical spell for the next area. If you've been conserving your magic points by making your mages do weak melee attacks so far, this will be your big break. The other treasures in the castle are no joke either. There's another ice sword which should have proven its usefulness in dungeons past, a gold bracelet in case you didn't have enough money to buy them for all your mages, and a heal staff. The heal staff has the spell Heal attached to it, which will restore around 18 health points to your party members per turn. It doesn't seem like much, but if you face an enemy that can only hit your characters for 1 HP, you could just spam it to make a full recovery. It's another great tool. At the top of the short Castle of Ordeals, there are 2 zombie dragons guarding your offering of courage. It's too bad. They're too easy too, especially if you hit them with Fire 3. Defeating them earns you the Rat Tail and ends the easiest dungeon in a while. Drive your airship back to the Cardia Islands, enter Bahamut's temple, and offer up the Rat's Tail. As promised, he will honor your characters. The screen transitions, and suddenly your first character on the map looks a little different. If it was a fighter, then the fighter will suddenly have shoulder pads. Speaking of, it's a nice feature that whatever character is first in your party order will appear on your map with a different sprite. What you have just done was unlock the class change. All your characters have transitioned to a greater version with boosted stat increases per level up and greater base stats. The classes have changed as follows. Furthermore, your characters are now capable of learning the max level spells. If you don't have a white mage, I hope you saved a level 5 magic slot because red wizards can learn life. Yeah, well, I didn't. This is probably the biggest mistake that I made in my entire playthrough of Final Fantasy I. Remember how I said way back in the beginning of the video that you can't remove spells? Well, before doing my research, I filled my Red Mage's level 5 magic with stuff I didn't even use. Again, white mages are absolutely stellar to have. Don't be dumb, think about your magic choices, and choose wisely. Make sure to also buy the level 6 white magic spell, Exit, from Crescent Lake. Funnily enough, the Knight and Ninja can use low-level magic. Good for elemental shields later and low-level cures, I guess. I have two problems with the class change. First, I have a master on my team. There's a bug that masters earn 4 times less magic defense than black belts upon leveling up. I dodged that bullet because I did so much money grinding back in Elfheim, but still, not cool, man. Second, the class change should have come earlier, I think. The Lich was one of the great Fiends who was rotting the world and ended up being an easy boss to defeat. Carry didn't really do anything and was much more difficult. I think to balance the game, the class change should have come either right before Lich or before Carry. Technically, you could do that by suffering through the ice cavern at an even more under-leveled pace, getting the floater, then raising the airship and doing that whole thing first. That, or parking your pirate ship at the river mouth next to the Castle of Ordeals. But, really, that still leaves you under the bar for Castle of Ordeal and Gulgu Volcano. You probably won't have the cash for prot rings, so the couple enemies that can KO your team will continue giving you problems. Whether you wish to make the game more annoying or not shouldn't have mattered. Anyway, your children have become buff adults, and now you can move on. I guess technically you could finish the game without receiving the class change, but I don't know how difficult that would be. Probably not much more. What's coming isn't easy either way. With that huge side quest finished and the characters powered up, it's time to seize the Water Fiend. But where do we start? There is an answer in Gaia. A pirate in Gaia says that he had sold a bottle with a fairy in it to a caravan. The fairy belongs to Gaia's lake on the northeastern border, and it's up to you to go retrieve her. So, you take your airship to find the caravan in the western desert. Set your airship down on the single free green tile between the desert, mountains, and forest and start looking for the caravan. Unfortunately, it's not a visible structure, you just have to run into it. At the very least, it's in a somewhat obvious spot. The only thing the caravan sells is the bottle with the poor fairy in it for 50,000 gil. If you have to do some grinding in the desert, that's probably okay since you've got your new classes that get great benefits from leveling up. Get the money, grab the ferry, get in the airship, go to Gaia, and release the ferry. In return for freedom, the ferry gives you the Oxyale. What? I still have no idea what the Oxyale is. It sounds like exhale, but it's not. I assumed it was some sort of scuba gear, because that's what you eventually do with it, but then again it just appears as Oxyale in your item menu. Use the power of imagination, I guess. Now, following the ferry's instructions, take the Oxyale to Onrac in the west, which is right next to the Sunken Shrine. I could have mentioned this place sooner, but the fact that you have to hike into Onrac every time you want to go there is a bit toilsome. The people of Onrac refer you this quest line anyway, so you would have had to hike there, ask around, hike back, fly to Gaia, ask the pirate, fly to the caravan, find the caravan, buy the ferry, fly back to Gaia, release the ferry, get the Oxyale, fly under the caravan's desert, and then hike back to Onrac. Trust me, you do not want to hike in and out of Onrac that many times. Onrac is a pretty average town. It doesn't have any new equipment, and the only thing you might want to buy besides items would be new spells. This would be a great town since Saber's on sale, you know, if Saber worked. Don't worry about these spells though. Saber doesn't work, Heal 3 is the same as Heal 2 except outside of combat, Blind is a pretty useless power word spell, and A-Rub is taken care of by the prot rings. You don't need to be afraid of instant KOs anymore, so there's no need for a spell that does the same thing. The NPCs have some information, but what's really confusing is all of the leg talk. Why is everyone in Onrac obsessed with having legs? Here's yet another example of why you need to survey the entire town before leaving. The entrance to the next dungeon is on the outskirts of Onrac, right where the houses meet the water. If you have the Oxyale, you can use the submarine. The submarine isn't like the other vehicles where you drive them around the map. This time, it just teleports you right into the Sunken Shrine. Credit is due here. I think this is the second best dungeon in the game. And no, it's not just because you can spam the Zeus Gauntlet and defeat literally everything in 10 seconds. It's nice looking is all, and the map design is pretty good. It's also the introduction of the lobster. I don't think real lobsters can poison people, nor are they monstrous. Tell that to my dinner plate. But the Zeus Gauntlet makes this dungeon super easy anyway. A lot of the enemies you face here have a high dodge percentage, but they can't dodge the Zeus Gauntlet. It does a good half of most things' health here in the Sunken Shrine. The worst enemy here is the Naga, and it's because the Naga has the most health as well as the ability to cast Lightning too, which somewhat hurts your party. There are 2 tasks in this dungeon, which would be in your best interest to do while you're here for the first and possibly last time. The upper floors contain a quest item required to access the last dungeon called the Slab, and the bottom floors contain the boss of the dungeon. I went topside first. It's better to go to the top first because you can find endgame melee armor up there, as well as 2 new elemental weapons on the way. Undead enemies were barely a problem beforehand, except for those that had a massive dodge percentage. And now, after obtaining the Light Axe, they're no problem at all. Even if you didn't have a white mage, you can now cast Harm 2, which will decimate groups of the undead. And if that weren't enough, you can also get the Mage Staff on the same floor, which casts Fire 2 in battle. Since the undead are weak to fire and holy magic, you've basically taken care of them for the rest of the game. On the top floor, there are no encounters, and you are free to loot the chests as you please. It's one of those grid rooms like the Marsh Cave that I didn't like, but this time it's forgivable since you aren't delayed by fighting and the rooms are pretty small. There are also mermaids which tell you that they will fade away if the water fiend is not taken care of. One of them says that she hasn't seen Daryl in a while and wonders if she grew legs when she went to land. Well, that explains all the weird talk on the surface in Onrac. Now that you can grab the opal armor from the chests, it's time to have an important talk about inventory space. This has never been a problem up until this point, but your mages probably have bracelets and no longer can hold on to new armor pieces to be sold or traded. Plus, there are also pieces of magic gear that is especially valuable. Here's the thing. Items such as potions and the loot take up some inventory space, but the potions stack and there's plenty of room for quest items. Weapons and armor have their own inventory for each of your 4 characters. This means 4 slots for each character for weapons, and another 16 total across 4 characters for armor. The issue though is that you share armor slots with equipped armor as well. So, if your character has both hands, their head, and body equipped with something, then they can't hold on to anything else. It's useful to have a character or 2 that doesn't wear much armor, such as a black belt or a mage, but even then you'll still be pressed for space. It takes a lot of research to decide what's important and what ranks above what. I wish that I had known about the opal armor before heading into the Sunken Shrine, because I would have sold some of the ice and flame equipment to make more room beforehand. However, it's good that the prot rings are better than the opal gauntlet than you pick up in the shrine. The game at this point has gone beyond the best weapons in stores, and now you must make use of lost legendary weapons found in the dungeons you pillage. After beefing up my fighter with the new armor, I headed down to the bottom floor through some long walkways. Something I really like about Final Fantasy I is that each floor of a dungeon has different encounters, so at least when you're fighting your way to the next stairwell it's something fresh. There's also a ribbon on the second to last floor, which is awesome for mages since it provides total elemental resistance. Wade through the lobsters, sea snakes, sea trolls, and tough water elementals to the water fiend. It's time to fight the Kraken. Actually, it's more like time to crush the Kraken. Compared to how powerful your party has gotten while traversing the Sunken Shrine, the Kraken should be easily beatable. It doesn't have magical attacks, instead using an ink attack which blinds the party, which is bugged, and an 8-hit melee attack. Really, if you use a melee defense spell, such as Fog 2 or Invis 2, then you're in no danger. 800 health points is a lot, but not that much by now. I quickly learned that when you level your master up, he will quickly destroy anything you set him on. That's 3 of the 4 orbs. I say that the last one, the Wind Orb, is still second in difficulty to the Volcano depending on your level. In order to get to the Wind Dungeon, you'll need to refer back to your notes. If you talk to everyone in Melmond, you may remember that there was a scholar of Lufenia there. If you take the slab to him, he will teach you the Lufenia language, allowing you to enter a new town on the far east side of the map. This will be the one and only time you visit this town, because it is simply the least useful town in the game. The only facility here is a magic shop for white magic and black magic. In fact, there is literally one thing you need to come here for, which is the chime. Most of the residents will say the same thing, although make note that one of them says, 5 of our Sky Warriors were turned into bats. No, this does not mean that the game creators trolled you and you need to go looking for 5 bats across the entire game that say something different. That would be stupid. You'll run into them at an opportune time. But the main thing that the citizens say is that they had been kicked out of their floating castle 400 years ago, had tried to reclaim it with 5 warriors 200 years ago, who were also then kicked out. There isn't a floating castle on the map, but according to the Lufenia, that's where they lived. I'd like to reinforce that between every single dungeon I've gone back to Coneria or Elfheim, taken a nap in the inn, and restored my full stack of heal potions. It hasn't gotten any less tedious, but at the very least the latest dungeons haven't made me blow through my stock entirely. With the chime, it's now possible to enter the Mirage Tower, right in the middle of the huge northeastern desert. Time to check it out. Mirage Tower is a pretty cool dungeon. It's too bad that you could complete it in 30 seconds with no encounters. Don't though, because you'll be skipping some of the best treasure in the game. You get the Aegis Shield, which wards off the Stone status, the Sun Sword, which is the first upgrade to the Ice Sword, the Thor Hammer, which also casts Lightning too, and the Heal Helmet, which also casts Heal. Basically, now you have extra spells that you can cast over and over. If you combine the effects of the Heal Staff and the Heal Helmet, then you can heal about 30 HP per turn per character. However, I recommend that if you're running out of armor slots, drop the heal helmet. You'll have spare weapon slots to keep the heal staff around. You'll also get the dragon chestplate for knights. Definitely wear this. It'll keep you alive way through this dungeon. Head to the top of the Mirage Tower and you'll meet a robot that says, "Transportation operation requires a cube." So, now what? Well, first you have to do the annoying task of fighting the blue dragon again, since you just walked through the forced tile, and then you have to figure out what the cube is. Well, there are a bunch of small NPC hints about some sort of waterfall cave that you haven't been to yet. There's only one waterfall on the map, and it's in the northwestern river, so you pack up and head to your airship for a quick detour. In a strange turn of events, I went to the Waterfall Cavern before entering the Mirage Tower. I think it was because I was confused since I took no notes during gameplay, so I checked with my guide to figure out what was next and just decided to hit the waterfall first. It's a short cave with some annoying dead ends but some good treasure. There's a weapon called Defense found here, which is counterintuitive, and another great ribbon. There's also plenty of money and a wizard staff which casts Confuse upon use. Not a very good weapon, and maybe the only magic weapon worth selling. It's also possible to run into a gas dragon in the Waterfall Cavern. Only a 2% chance, but it's only good for the 40,000 experience and 5,000 gil it drops on death. Once you have the cube, there's no point to staying, so head back to the Mirage Tower and plug the cube into the transporter in the middle of the top floor, after fighting the blue dragon again. Suddenly, you find yourself in the floating castle. This is the absolute weirdest place in the entire game. This dungeon is one of the very few that even has its own theme. It's weird because it's an oddly futuristic place in the middle of a medieval-themed RPG. Then again, your team rides an airship, so I don't know. Plus, the Lufenia said that they were highly advanced, but this is a Star Wars level of advanced. This is also my personal favorite dungeon in the game. I just like the abstract theme from the rest of the game a lot. I have two problems with it. I didn't get to fight Warmech because I didn't know it was there, which is not anyone's fault really, and the layout of the fourth floor. Otherwise, this is a perfect dungeon for the NES and for the game as a whole. The encounters in this dungeon are mostly renewed versions of enemies you've fought before. Nightmares, Nagas, vampires, mages, and more make a return in their GR or wizard form. If you remember the wizard ogre, it's something like that. There is a chance that you will run into the Eye from the ice cavern, but you've got all sorts of protection from getting instantly destroyed this time. The only dangerous random encounter is the sentry, which can do 200 damage in one turn. Spoils from this dungeon set you up nicely too. There's 4 magic weapons here that should not be passed up, especially since one of them casts an instant death spell. Armor slots are hard to spare this late into the game, but you absolutely cannot pass the black and white wizard robes in any sort of playthrough. The black robe casts Ice 2, and the white robe casts Invis 2. It's a free set of extra damage and melee protection. That new treasure is mixed with a lot of outdated treasure that you don't have the space for, though. Don't be worried about money, as you'll be dropping pieces of armor just to make room for the new ones. Gil is plentiful in the chests and in the encounters. Just Don't open the middle left chest in the 3rd floor east room. You don't need cloth. Cloth hasn't been useful since the start of the game. You'd be sacrificing a precious armor inventory space for something useless if you open the chest. The Lufenia called this a floating castle, but really it looks more like a space station. The only thing that seems somewhat castle-like are the borders that show up during battle. Besides that, it's all metal walls and floors. There are also plenty of robots up here, so go figure. If there was ever a certain map in the game that you could easily complete simply by skipping everything and walking in a straight line, it would be this one. In fact, I'd say that this dungeon has the simplest design in the entire game. If you want treasure, just deviate from the single vertical line of teleporters to one of the hallways on the side, and there it is. It's not even a long walk to get to one of these treasure rooms. You might run into a couple encounters, but besides that, it's free loot. The only floor of this dungeon that does not have the plus shape would be the 4th floor. The 4th floor is a looping grid of squares that is easy to get lost in, and there's nothing to be found while you're looking for the next teleporter. Honestly, just go northwest. Don't bother scoping this room out for ages, especially since the hardest normal encounters are on this floor. By now I'm sure you've noticed that a lot of enemies have elemental resistances and weaknesses. Since you have extra magic weapons, you can test what enemies are weak to an element. It's easy to tell which enemy would be weak to an element, such as mummies who can be burned or dragons that are weak to ice. This late in the game you have developed an intuition for it. Most of the level recommendations I've given for each dungeon are simply for a first-time casual playthrough. But if you know each enemy's weakness, you can enter these dungeons a lot sooner, like 3 levels sooner. You'll also know what enemies to fight and which to run from depending on their rewards. The 5th floor is a straight walkway to the Fiend of the Wind. On this walkway, you have a 5% chance to run into Warmech, who is honestly way more dangerous than the boss of the dungeon. In fact, Warmech is probably on the level or higher of the final boss. The problem with Warmech is that its attacks are so powerful that they usually bypass any of your team members' defense, magic or physical. It can also use its nuclear ability, which can decimate your team in a single turn. It can do up to 320 damage. At this point, 320 damage is plenty enough to sweep your team of mages. Beating Warmech is a battle of attrition. If you got the Adamantite from the 2nd floor and took it to the Dwarf Cave, you could attack Warmech with the new Excalibur. Excalibur is the 2nd best melee weapon in the game, and can do upwards of 400 damage in one turn. For Warmech, though, you'll only be able to do about 100. If you can outlast the Warmech's 1000 HP, then you're supremely rewarded with 32,000 gil in experience. I wanted to fight this boss after I beat the game. Sure, if I had accidentally run into it when I reached this area for the first time, I probably would have gotten team wiped. But it's a man-made destruction machine. Who wouldn't want to fight it? No matter what happens, you still have to fight the Fiend of the Wind, Tiamat. I don't understand what this boss is, nor how it's any different from the Hydras that were in the rivers or even in this dungeon. And I feel like Tiamat got robbed. Tiamat is almost as easy to beat as the Lich was. She's got 1000 HP and all of the dragon attacks, but you should have all of the elemental shields in some form. That's either the ribbons, the spells A-Fire, A-Ice, A-Lit, etc., or even just the ability to tank it. Maybe this boss was easy because I had a master on my team. This is the point where masters become incredibly broken. If you set the master on an enemy, you can basically guarantee that the enemy will be defeated by the next turn. During my Tiamat fight, my master literally just did enough damage to surpass Tiamat's 80 defense points and kept landing 200 damage attacks on her. Not to mention that I also had a black wizard use Nuke, which did another 330 damage in the first turn. I'm not sure what Tiamat could have done in that situation, because half of her health was already gone, and I had also put down a lightning shield for her first magic attack. But the greatest reason why Tiamat got robbed of being a formidable boss would be her weakness to poison. If you grab the Bane sword on the first floor, you can literally just cast Bane and end the fight. Break works too if you have that. I didn't recommend grabbing any of the instant KO spells because you don't really need them to beat the game, but having them in a specific situation like this can help you avoid taking heavy damage. It's just, I don't know, it's not as fun winning that way. The altar behind Tiamat lights your final orb. Now what? Well, this isn't the end of the game. Remember the circle of sages from Crescent Lake? Well, one of the sages told your party to come back repeatedly after defeating more of the Fiends. Time to make a field trip. Once you go to them, they have another large story piece to give you. Turns out that there is an evil up to a plot more sinister than just kidnapping the princess. This evil and the four fiends have been conspiring to destroy the world repeatedly. The Final Fantasy world has been stuck in a 2,000-year-long time loop, where the fiends are free to destroy the world each time. Once the fiends have sapped the world of its power, they send the greater evil back another 2,000 years to set up the whole thing again. This game did the time travel thing well by not using it to head the story, but I think that it's unnecessary at the end of the game. Plus, what about the other infinite times that the evil was sent back? Were there no light warriors any of those other times to stop it? Or is this the first time that a time loop has capable warriors that could stop it? It raises a ton of questions that really don't have answers. It's just like, time loop and you have to stop them, yeah. At the very least, the title of the game makes sense now. So the Circle of Sages say that in order to confront the evil, you need to also travel back in time. There is a place to do that, actually, and it's in the middle of the Four Fiends dungeons. That is the first dungeon of the game. You know, the one that was 10 seconds long. Prep your warriors and head on back in your last airship flight. There is a magic orb here, which your 4 light orbs override, and you're able to travel back in time. Welcome to the final dungeon of the game. This is honestly not a bad final dungeon, though it is just a straight shot to the final boss. The dungeon is structured as one huge walkway where you must do a full castle tour before reaching the final boss. The enemies that you'll face while walking will keep you entertained. All of the toughest foes from the last 2 dungeons, the Sunken Shrine and the Floating Castle, are here. Luckily though, if you learn their weaknesses while playing through those dungeons, you should be able to defeat them easily. The first floor's most dangerous enemy would be groups of chimeras, who can cast the enemy's special spell, Cremate. It's all fire and ice on the first floor, so answer these enemies in the opposite kind. The second floor has mostly enemies that are weak to fire, with the exception of more chimeras. You could also run into a Chimera, which is slightly tougher and can poison your team. But at this point, everyone in your team has some sort of elemental resistance armor, so who cares? If you picked up the 3 ribbons and buffed up the odd party member out, you won't need to worry about any status effects for the rest of the game. The top floor is not where the final boss is. Up here, there are a bunch of group enemies that you should take out fast before their damage accumulates on your team. Gas dragons are weak to ice, which you'll see up here too. Once you reach the middle of the floor, you must use the loot that you've likely carried the entire game for the first time. The beautiful music is so beautiful that it destroys the slab. It's sad that you never get to hear the beautiful music, you're just told about it. Before you do that, first you have to beat the Phantom, which is an upgraded version of the monster you fought to retrieve the floater. It still has more instant KO spells, so you just sick your master on it. No big deal. That, or small fire attacks. If you didn't get the loot, well, too bad. You gotta reset your console in the last save and talk to the Conerian Princess Sarah. As far as treasure goes in this final dungeon, You'll only want a couple things. 3 of the chests in the dungeon have gil for some reason. I mean, you're 2,000 years in the past in an inescapable dungeon. Whatever gold you got from the floating castle, for example, my wallet had 547,000 gil after the final dungeon, which is just too much, is plenty. You can't even use the gil in the past, so why bother grabbing more? In order to get back to any store, you would have to reset your console anyway. Now use the revealed pathway to descend through the castle on the other side. You won't see any new enemies until you reach the first basement, where there are more fire-vulnerable enemies and low-health enemies. Just spam the mage staff, really. At the end of the walkway, you'll have to fight the Lich again, but this time the Lich isn't messing around and he'll just nuke your team. Nuke coming from an enemy is horrid. Sure, your characters are more than ready to survive it, but they'll be left with minimal health to spare. So then, you just have to use half of your health potions to restore the health lost to such a sudden move. It's really just a pain. I'd also like to remind you that my stupidity prevented me from bringing the life spell to the final dungeon, so I basically restarted the dungeon until I was able to get an instance where I could beat the Lich without suffering from nuke. That way I could last until the final boss. The 5th floor or 2nd basement has a super long walkway with encounters that are all weak to ice. Use the black robe to great effect here. You could just head for the door once reaching the other side, but the pro cape isn't far. You could go on a long hike and get the extra katana on the left, but if you don't have 2 ninjas, don't bother. Just don't take the right path because you don't need any more gil. Unless you're trying to max out the wallet at 999,999 gil, don't bother. Carrie is waiting on the singular tile doorway to the stairwell. Just cast A-Fire and use the white robe, and then you basically won't take any damage. Since you're not so far into the dungeon this time and aren't starved for resources, you can decimate her. Something to note though, all of these bosses have 100 extra health and have upgraded spells. The original Carrie casted Fire 2, but this one uses Fire 3. She also has Rub, but again, you have armor that resists instant death now. It's no issue. After the easiest floor of the dungeon, you get to another prolonged basement. Follow the walkways and use the Zeus Gauntlet to electrocute all the water-themed enemies on this floor. The only thing special here is the Kraken fight right before the exit to the 4th basement. Use melee defense spells, and once again, you've already won. The last floor is the most important. It's based around the floating castle, and of course that means that Tiamat is waiting for you. This time, though, you can't cheat and use Bane. Not that it makes the fight any harder, though. If you use Alit and Fog too, you'll be perfectly fine. What you really want in the 4th basement, though, is the treasure in the southeastern corner. Go down from the entrance and follow the walkway to the right until you get to the peninsula with the one lone chest in the small room. In it is the greatest weapon in the entire game, the Mazmune. I really wish that you got the Mazmune a bit sooner, like from the Circle of Sages before ever entering the Temple of Fiends Past. The only 2 things that you can really test its might on are Tiamat and the final boss. It's anticlimactic, really. Spread out the damage on your team, though. You'll have the Excalibur for knights, too. The Mazmune can be used by anyone. I like that the journey through the Temple of Fiends Past resembles your journey through the game. All enemies on each floor are themed around the fiend you fought in that area. It's a nice touch for an otherwise empty dungeon. The last floor is the coolest looking floor of the dungeon and possibly in the top 3 of the best looking floors in the game. There's no encounters here, it's just you and the final boss. Heal up your team and head into the center of the pentagram where you'll find Garland. You know, that one guy at the beginning of the game who you tapped with a couple toothpicks and he went down? Well, guess what? He's the final boss. Or at least, the incarnation of the evil that spawned the 4 fiends inside of him is the final boss. This is the final boss of the game, Chaos. I've never fought Warmech, so I can't make a good comparison, though he is definitely the hardest enemy in the entire game otherwise. He has a staggering 2,000 HP, which is twice as much as anything else in the game, not counting the Tiamat refight that has 1,100 HP. All three of his abilities, whether they are physical attacks, magical attacks, or enemy special attacks, are equally devastating. And that's not even the worst part. Chaos also has 100 defense points. If you can't do more than 100 damage in a single hit, you'll barely be able to hurt him at all. He resists every element in the game, so your mages either have to use nuke or do nothing. He can also dodge one half of the attacks thrown at him and has 100% magic defense. And that's not even the worst part. If you're setting up for a prolonged battle, don't. Chaos's 4th spell in line is Cure 4, so if you manage to get him down at all in that time and he manages to cast it, all of your work is for nothing. If you manage to survive long enough for him to cast the next 2 spells, he'll then use Fast and just end your game entirely. Nuke is next in line after that. The best strategy is to beat him as fast as physically possible. If you can cast Nuke, it'll help somewhat, but your mages are better off supplying whatever defenses are possible in order to keep your melee attackers alive. Cast A Ice, cast A Fire, cast A Lit, Fog 2, whatever. It's not worth trying to dodge Chaos. He has a 183% hit rate, so you'd need to cast Invis 2 at least 3 times. And, considering all of the other things in Chaos's repertoire, you can't afford to waste that many turns. The best thing you can hope for is that you have elemental resistances to earth attacks and Chaos decides to waste a turn on the enemy's special attack, Crack. But after that, his special attacks are group wipes that do hundreds of damage. You'd only get 1 wasted turn. So that's all you can do. Don't waste any time and take him out fast. The MVP of my team goes to my Master, since he did 90% of the work even with the Excalibur and Masmune on my team. Then again, I did land the defeating blow with the Masmune, but getting there was nerve-wracking. Honestly, I think Chaos is unfair to put at the end of the longest dungeon in the game, especially since you'll have to walk all the way back from a save at the door of the present Temple of Fiends. However, it is really thrilling to get that far and take a crack at him. When you finally beat Chaos, the entire screen shakes as he disintegrates. You're presented with a final cutscene that explains how Chaos came to be and congratulates you as the 4 Light Warriors for taking him down. The speech at the end is uplifting, stating that your story will be passed on. It's an interesting glory. The only other thing I have to say that the speech doesn't, though, is that Garland should get good. The end is etched and sketched onto the text box, signifying the end of the game as the ending theme plays on. At the end of these reviews, I will rank the game that I am reviewing out of 50. There are points to be earned in a bunch of subcategories that will make up the final score out of 50. Some of these games vary by the system they are played on, so I will measure their merits accordingly. These subcategories are as follows: sound design, gameplay, story, graphic design, and world design. Final Fantasy would serve as a baseline for a ton of other RPGs, and for good reason. The battle system in this game specifically is super solid. I haven't seen any other game use the multi-hit system where you can double your damage, but I wouldn't have minded if that became standard practice for other RPGs. The fact that you can choose your classes and name your characters specifically for your own story is something I wished more RPGs could do. Sometimes, imagination is all you need. One thing though, it's not cool that some of the combat mechanics are just plain broken. This would be corrected in later versions of Final Fantasy I, and none of the combat mechanics that are broken really destroy the game, but it's too easy to make an innocent mistake and stumble into a broken mechanic. Like temper, for example. If you didn't know beforehand that it was broken, why wouldn't you get it? That, and some of the enemies get cheated out of their abilities too, simply because the dark status effect doesn't work. I also think that the magic system is better off acting on a shared magic cost where more powerful spells cost more to cast. You just don't have enough magic to use it that often, and that's disappointing. Same thing goes for ether usage that would show up in later games, and the Phoenix Down item. I have one more praise, that the grinding in this game wasn't too bad. If you wanted to grind, you could, and you would receive great benefits for doing so. But if you didn't, you could learn enemy weaknesses and be rewarded just for being smart. That, or if you explored each area to its fullest, you need not grind at all. And I also have one more strike against the gameplay. Walking constantly is never fun. Luckily, the battle system is addicting enough so that it isn't boring, but running into a dead end and wasting more time is still irritating. This story is pretty bland. I think saving Princess Sarah was supposed to be a way of poking fun at Super Mario for being bland, but generally just going to charge the orbs is also bland. What saves this story from mediocrity, though, are NPC tidbits and the interesting time travel part at the end. I like that progression requires you to interact with your world and meet all sorts of new people and species, and that helping them eventually helps you to the next dungeon. This story is far from the best on the NES, though. That trophy goes to Mother, or in the US, Earthbound Beginnings. The enemy designs are especially good in Final Fantasy. The actual fight may still be up to imagination, but the pixel art of the characters is what gets imagination the rest of the way. Especially the worms, which have all sorts of shading, and the bosses. Character designs are good too, especially after the class change. You don't have a lot of space to work with, and even with that small tile, the Warriors of Light look good. The maps are, well, they're maps. It's a clever usage of the same textures plus different colors for each place. Honestly, it's nothing outstanding, but plenty good enough. I like the maps in this game because they're all different even if they have the same structures. All NPCs have different outfits based on their town as well. The dungeon maps are what annoy me. Again, random dead ends matter a lot at the end of a dungeon and could mean doing it all over again. Floors with geometrical designs like the final floor of the Temple of Fiends Pass or the first floor of Gulgu Volcano are good floors, and grid floors such as the last floor of Marsh Cave are not. I also don't support getting lost on the overworld map. However, I do appreciate that for an NES game, the scale is massive. The songs in this game are all great, but I do wish that there were more. This game can be credited for the iconic Final Fantasy themes found in Victory and in Prelude. The overworld theme and the town theme are perfect for their areas, but they play almost everywhere. By the end of the game, I was starting to get annoyed specifically by the menu music, because by the time I learned how to speed through the menu, I would only ever hear the first 20 seconds or less of the song. The other issue I have here is that the menu forces the current area song to restart entirely. Overall, the songs are perfect for where they take place, but there's not enough variety.